Joshua chapter 10, we're going to jump right into it in verse 1. We covered part of this last time. I'm just going to read a few verses and really pick up solid in verse 7. Joshua 10:1, this is the southern campaign. Remember, Israel came in from the center of Jerusalem. On the east side, about the center, not Jerusalem, I'm sorry, but Israel. From the east, in about the center of the land is where the Lord had them enter. He split the land for Israel so that there would be then people on the north and people on the south. And here in Joshua chapter 10, we see this southern group, the southern group of Israel, the southern group of kings that come against Israel and against these men of Gibeon. The story will make more sense as we read it, but we're in the south, the southern part of Israel. It says, now it came about when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that this king, Adonizedek, feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. So the fear in the king of Jerusalem, this man Adonizedek, is that if Gibeon gave up, if Gibeon surrendered without firing a shot to Israel, and they're a greater city than Ai was, and Israel demolished Ai, what chance do I have against them? None at all. So he's fearing the men of Israel. He's fearing the God of Israel, as we'll see soon. And he's very upset. He's angry with the people of Gibeon, the traitors. I mean, here you have this group, all these nations in the land of Canaan, and Israel is coming in to defeat the land of Canaan. Why don't the kings of the land of Canaan get together? And that's what this king would have done from the start. He would have asked the people of Gibeon, hey, come in with me and let's defeat Joshua. What he's upset about here is that Gibeon gave up. They surrendered. So yes, he fears the Israeli army, but he's also angry with the people of Gibeon for giving up. Their traitors. They're traitors in the land of Canaan. And so he gathers a coalition force. Look what it says in verse 3. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem. Oh, by the way, you know what Adonizedek means? What does Adonai mean? Adonai. We use that word. We use that word to refer to Jesus, to refer to God. What does Adonai mean? It means Lord. It's the Hebrew word for Lord. You know what tzedek means? Tzedekah, there's a T-S at the beginning of that word. Tzedekah, it means righteousness. So this man who's going to form this coalition, this pagan man, this leader of a pagan people that are living in Jerusalem, this pagan idolatrous, worshiping false gods man, is called the righteous Lord. He's exactly the opposite. But isn't it interesting the ironies in the Bible that someone would have either called him, named him that, or more likely his people called him that, the righteous Lord. Wow. It shows how far these people were away from a proper worship of a God, that they would call this horrible pagan king a righteous Lord. So it says in verse 3, therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, he sent word to Hoham, the king of Hebron. See, forget the names. He's calling forth a coalition. He needs help. He wants the armies of the southern land of Judah or land of Canaan to come together to fight. And that's who these people are. So he calls together the king of Hebron. He calls Piram the king of Jarmuth, another city. He calls Japhia the king of Lachish, another city. And to Debir the king of Eglon, another city. So he's got these 5 kings that he wants to come together. And this is what he says in verse 4, come up to me and help. Now focus on who he wants help to fight against. He says, come up to me and help, and let us attack Gibeon. He wants to attack the traitors in his land. He's angry with his own Canaanite brothers who have surrendered to Israel. Who does he not want to fight directly? At least first, Israel. Why? Because the Bible says he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, even greater than Ai, and they gave up without firing a shot. So he fears Israel, but he's mad at Gibeon, and he wants his revenge against the traitors. So he says, come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So he wants to attack his own ex-friends, the Gibeonites. Verse 5, so the 5 kings of the Amorites, these kings that he just called together, they agree. The 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, they gathered together and went up with all their armies. Imagine the size of the army. They went up with all their armies, and they camped by Gibeon, and they fought against it. They were fighting against the city of traitors. So Gibeon has a choice to make. There's no way that this one city can defeat these 5 kings and their armies. So who are they going to turn to? They've only got one choice. They're going to turn to Joshua and the armies of the living God. Look what it says in verse 6. They understand that only Joshua and the God of Israel can defeat their armies and save their lives. The men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal. And they said, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country in the southern parts of the land of Canaan, all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Gibeon cries out to Joshua for help. Now what's Joshua's response going to be? Remember that the men of Gibeon were these manipulators that came to Joshua, and the men of Israel said that we come from a faraway land. They wore torn up clothes and worn out shoes and had stale bread. Remember, they came with this great ruse. They lied to Israel. And the foolish leaders of Israel accepted their lies and made a peace treaty with them because they thought that they were peoples from a land far away. So, having made a peace treaty with them, what should Joshua do? They just asked Joshua to come and fight a war for them. Is Joshua responsible for defending them in war? What do you think? Do you think that the peace treaty that Joshua made with these people said, if anyone comes against you in battle, we will come and we will sacrifice our own soldiers and we will defend you in battle? What do you think? Do you think that his peace treaty would have gone that far? Oh, this is interesting. I got as many yeses as I got nos. I say no. The peace treaty that Joshua signed with this people would simply be that we won't kill you. He doesn't sign a treaty that says if anybody else comes against you, we'll protect you to the death. No. If anybody else comes against you, that's between you and the Lord. We won't kill you. So Joshua doesn't have a responsibility by the covenant, by the treaty that he signed with them. He doesn't have a responsibility to defend this nation. But why does he? Because what we see is that Joshua, look what it says in verse 7, Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the valiant warriors. So Joshua hears from these men of Gibeon, come and save me, and he says, yes, I will. But why does he say that? It has more to do with military mindedness than anything else. He doesn't have to save the Gibeonites when some other pagan nation tries to kill them. What he's doing here is taking advantage of the situation. Heck, if 5 kings want to get together and all come against this one city and I can kill all these armies in one place at one time, that's what I'll do. It helped Joshua, the general, the military leader of Israel. It helped him out tactically. And that's why Joshua goes to fight at Gibeon. He doesn't owe them this. They've gathered together as one army, these enemies of Israel and enemies of Gibeon, to make it easy on Joshua. So the Lord's at work here. Joshua's not going to have to travel, as we'll see at the end of this chapter, from this city and then move on to this city and then move on to that city. He can fight 5 kings, 5 armies at one time, and he says, let's do it. I want you to see something else here. Joshua has just made a series of mistakes before this. Not only did Joshua foolishly enter into a treaty with men that God said, kill everything that breathes. They fooled him, and he allowed them to fool him, and he made a treaty with them. But he also, remember, in making them servants, brought them into the temple or into the tabernacle area. The men of Gibeon were to be servants in the service of Yahweh, which was wrong. So here we have Joshua just stepping all over himself, making mistake after mistake. But who is it that God calls out to continue leading Israel? My question is, does God remove Joshua from leadership because he makes a mistake or two? And I mean grave mistakes. What's Yahweh's response to Joshua? Get up, son. We've got work to do. So the statement that I'll make is God is not a one mistake and you're out God. He's a God of second chances and third chances and fourth chances. And let me ask you another question. How many chances has He given you in your life to get up from some sin and live to fight another day? How many chances has He given you? I don't know how many chances He's given me, but I'm telling you it's in the thousands. And so what do we see here in this man Joshua, who's fumbled all over himself in the last few weeks as far as leadership in Israel? You would think God would say, okay, Joshua, you're worthless. Please move aside. I'm going to call up another leader. That's not at all what God says. God says, you're not worthless, Joshua. You're my man for the job. Are you going to sin and fail? What's the answer? Are you going to sin and fail as my man for the job? Did I call you Joshua because you're perfect? No. He called Joshua because he would be faithful to God. He didn't call Joshua because he was perfect, just like He didn't call me to be a pastor because I was perfect, because I've attained to some sinlessness in life. I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, the opposite is the truth. He didn't call King David because King David was perfect. Look at the life of King David with Bathsheba and Uriah, her husband, who he has murdered, and all the problems that David had. Yet what does God say about David? He's a man after my own heart. He's the apple of my eye. So God doesn't call us because we're perfect, because there's no such thing as perfect. There's no such thing as perfect humanity, except for one man, the God-man, Jesus Christ. No one else has ever lived that comes close to that. So what does God do to Joshua, who's a fool, who's made foolish mistakes with the men of Gibeon? He says, get up, you're my man for the job. We've got work to do. You've restored your relationship with me. We've come clean. We understand each other. Move on. Move out. Many second chances. Many chances from the Lord. And you know what's interesting? I got to say this. I got to say this because I know my heart and I know your hearts. And when God gives us second chances, what do we say? Thank you and amen. But sometimes we look around the church, we look outside the church, we look at our families, we look at different situations, and sometimes, and I think we're all guilty of this, at least at one time in our life, there's someone out there that's done something that we have decided does not deserve another chance. Guilty? We have a list. It's not a righteous list, it's not a godly list, but all of us have in the past, if not right now, have a list of people that do not deserve, in our minds, a second chance. Now, I'm not saying everybody will get a second chance. You have to be repentant. You have to be humble. You have to be willing to understand your sin. You have to come to the Lord with a humble heart, a heart wanting to change and to please God, and you will meet a God of second chances. If you come arrogantly to the Lord with a high fist saying, I demand another chance, He'll crush you. But be careful with that list of people that you think are beyond the grace of God, because no one, friend, if they're still breathing air, no one is beyond the grace of God, the unmerited, undeserved favor of God. He pours it out on me, and I say, thank you, I don't deserve it. But sometimes He chooses to pour it out on somebody else, and I say, now, Lord, that's just wrong. You need to be crushing that girl. And we need to be careful with that, because vengeance belongs to God, not to us. Let God deal with His people the way He deals with His people. Just an aside. Gives Joshua many second chances, and Joshua destroyed Israel. You say, Rick, that's harsh that Joshua destroyed Israel. Joshua made a peace treaty with the Gibeonites and allowed idolatry to live in the land of Canaan. And that is what destroyed Israel, idolatry. Joshua started it. What does the Lord say? Not move aside, but let's get moving. We have other things to do. He still is man for the job. Verse 7, so Joshua went up from Gilgal. Remember, Gilgal was the military headquarters he'd set up just on the west side of the River Jordan. This is where Israel always went back after battle. This is where they restored themselves. This is where their families were. This is where the livestock and all the animals, all the provisions were. They went back to their headquarters, and then they'd move out again to a different place. Gilgal is the headquarters. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them. Listen to the Lord's encouraging words to this failing Israeli army leader. Get up, son. Get up. I'm still on your side. I've still chosen you. Now you know you're not perfect. Get up and move forward. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. I wonder if Joshua, have you ever felt this? I wonder if Joshua now, because he had a few bad days, really bad days. Have you ever had really bad spiritual days? Really bad days? Where you come pleading to the Lord to forgive you for what you've done? I wonder if Joshua, because of his mistakes, felt all of a sudden that he was unfit to lead. I wonder if he disqualified himself as unfit to be God's man for the job. Have you ever thought those thoughts? I've thought those thoughts. But here we see Yahweh respond to Joshua's failures with the words, strengthen yourself. Strengthen yourself, Joshua. You're still my man for the job. Grace and mercy we see from God. And what do we see as Joshua's response to these great words from Yahweh? Do not fear, be strengthened. I've given them into your hand. What does Joshua respond? He immediately, it says, Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. I mean, this man has a vigor and a purpose back. I know he had some bad days. He had to have felt unfit until the Lord came and restored his relationship. Does that remind you of anybody in the New Testament that walked away from a very close relationship with the Lord, who felt unfit, who then had to be restored to a relationship with the Lord with 3 questions around a campfire? Who am I thinking of? I'm thinking of Peter. You see it in the Old Testament, you see it in the New Testament, because there's nothing new under the sun. Peter said 3 times, I don't know the man, I don't know the man. The 3rd time, he invokes an oath, he curses, meaning he invoked an oath, probably something like, I swear to God, I swear on the name of Yahweh, I don't know this man. Horrible. And so how does Jesus come back to Peter and restore Peter to a relationship and a ministry? Peter, you said you didn't know me 3 times. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Do you love me more than these others? He said, tend my sheep. Peter, I'm going to ask you a second time, do you love me? Peter said, Lord, you know I love you. He says, then feed my lambs. And he asked him a third time. Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus asked him 3 times. It was very discomforting if you read that in John chapter 21. Peter didn't like that line of question. It was very uncomfortable to him. But this is what Jesus chose to do. And he asked him a third time, Peter, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said, yes, I do, Lord. You know all things. You know that I love you. And he said again, then tend my lambs. And then right after that, after restoring Peter to ministry, after Peter was strengthened again by God, because we have bad days, and then the Lord lets us back in because He's gracious and merciful, and He restores our vigor and our purpose, and it happens to all of us, trust me, that God tells Peter, it's in this way that you will die. And He says, one day you will stretch out your hands and be led where you don't want to go. Jesus tells Peter, you also, friend, will be crucified one day. But now that we understand each other, now that you've been restored to fellowship with me, now that your life is on track again, don't ever fear again. Don't ever deny me again. Walk. I've got work for you to do. Get up and lead these men. They need a leader, and you're the one, Peter. So reminiscent of the book of Joshua. And I think reminiscent of many of our lives. So what does Joshua do? Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night. Just to give you an idea, this is a 25-mile march. Up 4,000 feet in elevation. From Gilgal up to where he's going to fight at Gibeon, 4,000 feet elevation change over 25 miles, marching all night with no sleep, minimal provisions. His men, when they get there, are exhausted. So God has to step in. You think, Father, I don't have what it takes to fight this battle. I don't have the energy. I'm not man enough. And God says, you stand up and be a man, and I'll do the hard part. You stand up, Joshua. So Joshua did. And he marched his army all night. Look what it says in verse 10. Because God has to get involved, because Joshua has an exhausted army. The Lord confounded them before Israel. These 5 kings have gathered all their armies around the city of Gibeon. And what does the Lord do? He goes to war for Israel. And for Gibeon, by the way. The Lord confounded the armies before Israel, and He slew them. Who's the He? Well, that's God. God slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. So it says the Lord confounded them, and He slew them. So God is clearly giving the victory. God is clearly in charge of the battle. But how is God killing the armies? Who's He using? He's using the armies of Israel. He's using Joshua's swords to slay the armies. So yes, God is doing it, but He's using Joshua and his men to do it. So yeah, God fights for Israel, but He's using Israel to fight. So there are times when God gives Israel the strength and sustenance to fight the battle, and then there are times when God gets involved directly. And you say, well, what does that look like? Keep reading. In verse 11, as they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, remember 4,000 feet in elevation. If you're coming out of that city, you're going down in elevation. So there's your descent. Look what happens. These armies, these 5 armies, many of whom have already been killed with the swords of Joshua and his Jewish army, they start fleeing before the armies of Israel. So what does God do? Not just yet. God wants everything killed that breathes, and God sees to it that that happens. While they were on the descent at Beth Horon, the Lord, Yahweh, this is all capital Lord. This is Yahweh, the Creator God of the universe. Yahweh threw large stones from heaven on them. Have you ever read that verse? Yahweh threw large stones from heaven on the armies as they were fleeing Israel as far as Azekah, and they died. And look at the next phrase. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So who's fighting here? Is Yahweh fighting the battle, or is Joshua and the Israeli army fighting the battle? What's the answer? Both. Both. Joshua and his army have their swords out and they are slaying many men. God is giving them the strength after having marched all night and gone up a mountain 25 miles. God is giving them a supernatural strength to destroy his enemies. And God also directly intervenes. This reminds me of David and his sling, his stones, the 5 smooth stones that he slung out at the forehead of Goliath. God isn't just throwing hailstones down and hoping they hit something. Here we see a laser-focused attack from the God of heaven, throwing hailstones directly at people in a way that'll kill them quickly. It's not chaotic. It's perfectly ordered by God. So then in verse 12, I'm going to tell you before I read it, this is the most popular verse in the Bible that is attacked by scientists. You say, okay, explain what you mean by that. Let's read the verse. Now, attacked by scientists. Read the verse and tell me why the world's scientists would attack the Bible as being unscientific, inaccurate when it comes to science. It says, then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. So on this day that they're having this battle, Joshua speaks to Yahweh, and this is what he says. In the sight of all Israel, Joshua calls out, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, stand still. It's not in there, but he means the same thing. O moon, stand still in the valley of Ajalon. This verse, the scientists go to and say the Bible doesn't know a thing about the solar system. This God-breathed book, this God that you say created all things, if he created all things, certainly he would know how the solar system works. And in this verse, it shows and proves to science that God doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to how the solar system works. Why? Because everyone knows, we all know, that the sun does not move around the earth, causing day and night. The sun's not the object in the sky that's moving. If Joshua tells the sun to stand still, then Joshua doesn't understand that the earth goes around the sun. The sun doesn't move. So the Bible is inaccurate, right? I'm going to say this about this verse. Well, number one, the Bible's not inaccurate about anything. Yes, God did create the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. But what Joshua's not trying to make a scientific statement here. Joshua is using what's called the language of observation. Now listen to what I'm saying. I'm not trying to go beyond the Bible to prove the Bible with some strange logic. No, that's not at all what I'm doing. I'm saying that Joshua is using what we use today all the time. He's using what's called the language of observation. From Joshua's perspective on earth, looking up, when Joshua looks at the appearance of the sun, does the sun appear as if it moves in the sky? Yes, it does. So the language of what Joshua simply is observing, and what Joshua calls out to the Lord is, Lord, however you do it, make that sun stop where it's at. I need more time to kill your enemies, and I'm asking you to do the impossible. All of my life, every day I've been awake, I've seen that sun appear to come up in one spot and move across the earth and settle in the west. I'm asking you today to stop that thing right there in the sky. Joshua's not trying to be a scientist here. Joshua is simply using the language of observation. He wants the sun to appear as if it's standing still. Now, let me ask you this. You say, well, I don't know about that. We do it every day. Do you know scientifically, now let's just get scientific for a minute, that the reason it appears as if the sun comes up, comes around, and goes down is not because the sun is moving, but it's because the earth rotates on its axis every 24 hours. Every 24 hours, the earth does one spin around its own axis. Not around the sun, that takes 365 days. But every day the sun rotates around its axis. And when it spins away from the sun looks like it's gone away. When it spins back around, wherever you are on the earth, it looks like the sun is coming back into view. It looks like the sun is moving. It is not. We know that. But yet, what did we call this morning? If you watched the news last night, if you're a fisherman and you're trying to figure out what the best time to fish is, what do you want to know in the morning? What time what is? Well, yeah, the tide, but you're a better fisherman than me. My question is, when is sunrise? Sunrise? I thought you people were scientific. What do the meteorologists call it? What do the newsmen on TV call it? What do they call it in the science textbooks? Sunrise. What do they call it at 6 o'clock or so, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock? Now, when it looks like the sun disappears, what do we call that? Sunset. Is that a scientific fact? Is the sun really rising and the sun really setting? Is that a scientific fact? What's the answer? No. It's not a scientific fact. What they should be saying is, when is the earth's rotation so that the sun goes out of view? Nobody's going to say that. We use the language of observation. What does it look like happens? It looks like the sun rises up out of the ground. Interesting that Jesus, the sun, rose up out of the ground, right? And God gives us that remembrance every day at sunrise. It looks like the sun rises up in the ground and like the sun goes back into the ground on the other side of the earth. So all I'm trying to say is, the scientists try to pick at this verse and say, see, the Bible's inaccurate about how the solar system works. This verse doesn't say anything about how the solar system works. We use the same words today. If I looked up in the sky and I wanted this day to be longer, I'd say exactly what Joshua said. Lord, stop the sun in the sky. Does God know how the solar system works? Can our Bible be trusted? The answer is yes, 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 of course, yes. But the scientists love to pick at our Bible. But to Joshua's eye and to our eye, that's exactly what it looks like, so that's what he said. And scientists use this verbiage, sunrise and sunset, every day. So don't let them make you think, oh, that's a good point. Maybe our Bible's not right. It's garbage. It's garbage thinking. Neither of the terms, sunrise and sunset, are scientifically accurate, but we use them every day in human language because they communicate. It's the language of observation. So again, Joshua, let's get back into the story. He's had a few really, really bad days. Bad days of judgment. And now Joshua is fully back in force. Joshua has not only led his army to march all night, invigorated by the word of the Lord, do not fear, I've given them over. But now Joshua is asking for a miracle that's never happened on earth. Somehow Joshua thinks he has the authority to ask God to stop the sun in the sky, and somehow Joshua thinks that God can do it. Right? Joshua thinks this God, he can do that. Why does he think that? What has Joshua seen God do in his lifetime? He's seen him part the rivers of the waters of the Red Sea. He's seen him bring manna every morning. He's seen God bring water out of a rock. He's seen God part the waters of the Jordan River so the men of Israel, the people of Israel, could walk across it. For Joshua to turn to God and say, stop the sun. It's not, oh Lord, if you have the power and the authority to stop your created sun. It's none of that. He says, Lord, please take care of this. I'm fighting your battles on earth and I need more daylight. Give me more day. And the Lord says, you got it. How does God do it? It doesn't matter to me. I'm not God. I wouldn't know it if you explained it to me. Did He stop the earth from rotating? What would happen if the earth quit spinning? Caleb, what would happen if the earth quit spinning? The sun would stay still, but it would drastically distort gravity on earth. So how did God do this? I have no idea. It doesn't matter to me. The fact of the matter is God can do it, and God did do it. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, we read in verse 13. The sun didn't stand still. It only appeared as if it stood still while God did something with the earth's rotation or something. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation Israel avenged themselves on their enemies. And then it says this, some of you have asked about this book. Is it not written in the book of Yashar? This event, the writer of Joshua is inviting the readers of this book. When they get to this, you say, I don't know about that. Joshua says, not only can you trust the Bible, but there's another history book. There's the book of Yashar, which is history written in poetic form. It's a poetry book about history. It's historical poetry. There's another book that writes about this event. Go look at the other book. It's accurate history, and it will prove that this event really took place on this day. So he says, is it not written in the book of Yashar? If you want me to prove it, that the Bible's not the only book that says this, go to the history books. It's there also. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. So what do we have here? A 36-hour day, a 48-hour day. Who knows how long it was? God knows exactly how long it was because God caused it. Because Joshua asked him to. Again, the book of Yashar. Let me make a couple of statements. It's not a Bible book. It's not a God-breathed book. It wasn't written by God the Holy Spirit through a man's pen. It is a Jewish historical poetry book. And the book of Yashar records the deeds of the mighty men of Israel all throughout their history. Look at what it says in 2 Samuel chapter 1 concerning this book. David, this is when Saul and Jonathan, Saul is the first king of Israel. This is years later, about 400 years after Joshua chapter 10. But this event takes place. It says, then David chanted with this lament over Saul. He writes a song. He writes a song for his father-in-law Saul, who's been killed, and for Saul's son Jonathan, who is a very close friend of David's. David writes a song. We know that song because it's written in the Bible. We also know that song because it's written in this book of Yashar. Look what it says. David chanted with this lament over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Yashar. So there's this other Jewish history book that this chant, this song, this lament that David wrote is recorded in. It's in the Bible and it's also in the book of Yashar. So the deeds of the great men of Israel, Saul, the king of Israel, Joshua here, these things are written down in this book of Yashar. Now, in what library can you find the book of Yashar? None. We just don't have it. It's been lost to antiquities. It's been lost in the history of the world. Does that mean it never existed? No. It just means we don't have it. This was thousands of years ago, Joshua chapter 10, and this book and its history and its poetry didn't survive. So, again, the writer of Joshua and the writer of 2 Samuel are saying, if you want more proof for what I'm telling you in the Bible, then go to the book of Yashar. It says the same things about this longest day the earth has ever known. It really happened. Verse 14 says, there was no day like that before it or after it. There's never been another day like this. When the Lord listened to the voice of a man, that's Joshua, for the Lord fought for Israel. Why did God do this? Because He wanted Israel to destroy the pagan kings that had come together. That's what Joshua wanted. It was in the will of God. God said, Joshua, you want to fight all day? You want to fight into the night without the sun going down? That's exactly what we'll do today. Joshua listened, or the Lord listened to Joshua and gave him the desire of his heart. Now, my question is, can God really do this? We have the Bible that says it. We have the book of Yashar, apparently, that has this recorded, that God can stop the celestial beings, the stars, the moon, the sun, the earth, that God can stop their motions. Do you believe that He can really do that? Look what it says in Psalm 33, verse 6 through 9, concerning this earth and who has control of it. It says, by the word of the Lord, this is all capital Lord, this is Yahweh, this is the same Yahweh that Joshua pointed to the sun and said, Lord, let that sun stand still in Gibeon. This is the same Lord. It says, by the word of the Lord, the voice, the mouth, the wording, simply breath. God breathes out a word. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and by the breath of His mouth, all their host. All the heavens, all the stars, the universes, the galaxies, the planets, everything. At a split second in time, God breathes out, and there they are. And what else does it say about His abilities on this earth? It says He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. Hurricanes, water spouts, tides. A low tide is the Lord gathering the waters of the sea together as a heap as they lift up and move away from the shore. If you want to be a scientist, that's all God. God does all that. He gathers the water of the sea together as a heap. By the way, He uses the moon to do that. So He controls the moon. He lays up the deeps in the storehouses. Let all the earth fear Yahweh. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of Him. For He spoke. None of us can speak and get anything accomplished. Just by a word, we can't make anything happen creatively. But God simply spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. Can God command the waters? Yes. Can God command all the host of heaven, which He made, all the sun, the stars, the moon, whatever He wants to? What's the answer? Yes. So does Joshua chapter 10. Could it be true, or is this just a fairy tale in the Bible? It's perfect truth. It's perfect truth. And the scientists love to go to Joshua 10 and attack us as old, foolish, not understanding Christians. You have such little minds. If only you knew the way the solar system works. They won't turn to Psalm 33 and bow their knee before a God who can do anything and who made everything. Verse 15, Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. The battle is over. They return to the camp, the headquarters in Gilgal. And in verse 16, it backtracks to the earlier parts of the story. So in verse 15, it appears everything is over. In verse 16, but I need to give you more information about what happened on this day. That's how the writer wrote this. And so verse 16, what about these 5 kings? It says, now these 5 kings, remember, Adonizedek, the righteous Lord of Jerusalem, him and his 5 king coalition, these 5 things had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. Why would the kings flee? Now, of course, they're afraid of the armies, their armies that are being destroyed. They see the hailstones fall out of heaven and pick off their army soldiers one at a time with a precision that was unbelievable. So they're scared, and they certainly don't want to die also, but there's something else that's going on here. There's another reason why these kings are terrified and why they flee from Joshua and from his God Yahweh. Look what it says back in Joshua chapter 5, verse 1. What do these kings know? It says, it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, that's this group of 5 kings, when the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, that's another group we'll get to next week, when they heard how Yahweh had dried up the waters of the Jordan River before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel, and I would add, and their God. When they saw what Israel's God did to the Jordan River, they were terrified. It says their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them. So these kings get together against this city of Gibeon, and in marches Yahweh, the God who dried up the waters, and all of a sudden they're seeing these hailstones fall out of heaven. What are they coming to understand very quickly? Yahweh is more powerful than their gods. The gods of the Amorites, if you don't know, were mainly the sun god and the moon god. These were the gods that the Amorites worshipped, the sun god and the moon god. And what had Yahweh, the true sun god and the true moon god, just done to the sun and the moon? He made them appear to stop in the sky. These kings are terrified. They're having a religious event. They worship their false god of the sun and their false god of the moon. And not only have they seen Israel's God part the waters of the river, they've also seen Israel's God stop the sun in the sky, whom their gods are supposed to control. And they've also seen the God of Israel, Yahweh, throw hailstones from heaven. This is a religious event for these kings. They are finally coming to understand we were wrong about our false gods. Yahweh is stronger. And they are fleeing in terror. Verse 17 says, it was told to Joshua, the 5 kings have been found. They're hiding in a cave in Makkedah. The battle is going on still. The kings have fled. But Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, assign men by it to guard it, but do not stay there yourselves. Leave a few guards, and you go finish fighting the war while the Lord keeps the sun still in the sky. You pursue your enemies, attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. Continue the fight. Remember, I tell you, this is a backtrack. It's a backtrack to tell more about what happened on this day. It came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed and the survivors who remained had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp at Makkedah in peace. Now they come back to where Joshua is at this cave where the kings are. Joshua says, seal them in here, go fight the battle, and then come back here, and that's what they've done. No one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. I bet, because Yahweh had shown himself supreme on this day. Let's keep reading quickly. Verse 22, then Joshua said, the battle is over, but what about these kings? He says, open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. And so they did so. And he brought these 5 kings out, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. What's Joshua going to do with the kings? When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the chiefs of the men of war. So he brings his general staff, the leaders of his army forward. And he says, come near and put your feet on the necks of these kings. That shows utter destruction, utter authority over the kings, utter annihilation of their kingdom. It shows authority. So they came near and they put their feet on their necks. Let me ask you a question. Where's Jesus right now? Right now, where's Jesus Christ? He's at the right hand of the Father. He's seated at the right hand of the Father. What's He waiting for? What does the Bible say He's waiting for? Look what it says in Psalm 110 verse 1. The Lord, God the Father, says to my Lord, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, sit at my right hand until when? What is He waiting for? Until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. What does Joshua just have the general staff do? Put your feet on the necks of these kings, because it shows that you are the victor and they have been defeated. So one day Jesus Christ will come, and the image is that just like Joshua's generals, he will put his foot on the necks of all the pagans who would love Israel to be destroyed. That's what it means. Until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Because when a king puts his foot on another king's neck, it shows total defeat. Jesus wins. Joshua then said to them, do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. So afterwards, Joshua struck them, these 5 kings. He put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. It came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees, and they threw these 5 bodies of royalty, of kings, even the righteous lords, Adonai-Zedek, they threw their bodies into the cave where they had hidden themselves. And they put large stones over the mouth of this cave to this very day. I'd love to go find that cave and find those bones. It's there somewhere. Now Joshua, very quickly, I'm not going to read all this. I just want to show it to you. We're asking the question, did Joshua learn his lesson about making foolish covenants with people in the land of Canaan? Did Joshua and his army now begin to kill everything that breathes? Does he leave any survivors? Look what it says. Joshua captured Makkedah. He struck it and its king with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. See, there's no more playing around with Joshua. He understands that the Lord wants him to kill everything that breathes. No survivors. Look what it says in verse 29. They passed on from Makkedah to Libnah. They fought against Libnah. Look what it says in the middle of verse 30. He left no survivor in it. Is Joshua being fooled by people? Is Joshua being taken by these stories? Oh, we're a people from a faraway land. We've journeyed a long way to make peace with you because we've heard how vicious you are and how strong your God is. No, Joshua isn't asking any question. Joshua's doing the work of the Lord now. He's killing everything that breathes. Verse 31, he went from Libnah to Lachish. They fought against it. Look what it says in verse 32. Every person who was in it, they killed with the edge of the sword. In verse 33, Joshua defeats the king of Gezer. In verse 34, he went from Lachish to Eglon. I'm just trying to show you the big picture here. He moves on to another city. All these cities, if you look at the map, all these cities are in the southern part of the land of Canaan. He's gone to Gibeon and he's fought 5 kings and their armies, and now he's going out from place to place and having battles, and he's killing everything that breathes. He passed on to Eglon. They camped. They fought against it. Verse 34, he utterly destroyed, or verse 35, he utterly destroyed that day every person who was in it. In verse 37, he goes on to Hebron. It says he left no survivor. In verse 38, he returned to Debir, another city that he had passed. He fought against it. What's it say in verse 39? He utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivor. In verse 40, Joshua struck all the land, the southern land, the hill country and the Negev. That's the desert in far southern Canaan, and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no survivor. But he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua is in control of the armies again. He's been strengthened by the Lord. He's been restored to a proper relationship as a leader of the Israeli army, and he's obeying every word that God says. He's destroying everything that lives. No more tricks, no more games, no more covenants with any of these people. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea even as far as Gaza, which is still in the news today, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal, their headquarters. It's a southern campaign in one chapter. In chapter 11 next week, we're going to go to the northern campaigns and how God would have Israel destroy all the people of the land of Canaan in the north. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father,